Africa's the future and the world is fighting to be their best friend. So let's shift away from Ukraine and Saudi Arabia towards the African continent because things are really heating up there. Now we have the world powers all converging with Russia, China, and of course, America sending their diplomats to win Africa's support. I think we are beginning to realize the world is splitting into zones and every faction is trying to swing over the undecided nations. And the big prize is Africa. Now, in January, we had China's new foreign minister traveling to 5 African countries to win over the region and strengthen ties. And from Russia, we have Sergei Lavrov visiting the region as part of the Russia-China joint military exercise with Africa, right? He visited South Africa, one of the BRICS nations, before heading to Angola and other nations. But what's interesting is how he was embraced as a friend, with South Africa's minister calling the joint naval drills exercises with friends, right? And of course, we have the United States sending Janet Yellen on a last minute scramble to re engage with the continent. Now, suddenly, America's interested in Africa, and we need to understand why, guys. The continent is an emerging market with over 1.4 billion people, with an incredibly strong population growth rate of over 2%. Now, Africa, they have the resources that the world wants access to, especially China and the USA. And just imagine, the continent is home to 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including gold, platinum, plus also 12% of the world oil reserves. And this is very important. This is key. That's a lot of untapped potential in the ground. It kind of reminds us of the Middle East back in the 1940s and the 50s when there was a rush to secure oil and gas there, right? Both America and China needs Africa to grow their economies. One is developed while the other is fast catching up in GDP. So the potential for growth for both powers is going to plateau sooner or later. But Africa is the shining jewel because they have just so much room to grow. So whoever can win over their support will have the financial power and most importantly, commodities to continue growing, right? Africa is the next frontier for growth. So what is the main agenda in Africa? And let's start with Russia, guys. For Russia, it's very simple. They are trying to build allies and most importantly, find another outlet for their energy sales. Now, we know the G7 is trying to squeeze Russia with their oil price caps, and there's only so much energy Putin can sell to India and China, right? The EU is about to slap Russia with a refined fuels embargo, and there's a fear that Asia won't be able to support the additional supply, right? They won't be able to absorb the additional oil. And obviously, Russia wants the revenue to keep flowing, and Africa is a place where they can export their oil to. So Russia's intention is rather quite transparent, right? It's rather clear. And during the UN Security Council last September, 19 African countries abstained from voting to condemn Russia, so they are at least still neutral towards the country. But for China, it's all about spreading their influence by being an investor and helping to build up infrastructure in the continent. Between 2000 and 2019, China committed 153 billion to Africa in loans for various public projects like infrastructure building. And China is also about to surpass the EU as Africa's biggest trading partner. And as we can see, China is exporting more to Africa than importing from the continent. And this tells us that Africa is becoming a major consumer market for the Chinese economy. And let's remember all the threats from the West about decoupling from China. We have Germany wanting to break away and the US wants to reduce trade, right? And this is why China, they are building ties with Africa. They have to hedge their bets. But the main agenda China wants is to extend its Belt Route Initiative or the BRI into the heart of Africa. And the BRI is a global network of ports, roads, and railways to connect China to the rest of the world. And it's really extensive, guys. It involves a third of global trade and over 60% of the world's population. And by securing partnerships with the continent, China could extend the Belt Road Plan with ports in Africa to extend their trading routes direct to the continent, right? And according to China's officials, they built over 6,000 kilometers of railways, 20 ports, and 80 power facilities in Africa. And this essentially is a win-win proposition for both sides. The African countries approach China with a plan and China invests in it, right? Africa gets better infrastructure while China deepens their trading relations and builds up the economy of their future customers. And now, of course, the US is afraid of this happening. They don't want either Russia or China to get a foothold in Africa, and so they send their best and their brightest. They send Janet Yellen to the continent to spread American influence. But she's going about it the wrong way. Now, there are two main ways to build relationships, right? The first is to go in with a win-win proposition and present a case on your own merits. Maybe you want to help develop the country's infrastructure or their energy sector, but the focus should be why Africa should choose you. Now, the second way is to tear down others and make them the center of your pitch on why working with the US is better, which is unfortunately what Janet Yellen is doing. Yellen went around the continent reminding them of Russia's sanctions at every stop of her African tour. She mentioned how violation of those sanctions by local businesses or by governments, we would respond to it quickly and harshly. In fact, she warned South Africa, a BRICS country, about the consequences of violating US sanctions on Russia. So this re-engagement isn't really going off to a good start, but that's just the pleasant part, right? That's just the pleasant part. It gets worse as the topic shifts to China. Yellen said China was a barrier to ending Zambia's debt crisis, and this is a jab at China, indirectly saying China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy and criticizing Beijing's excessive lending to Africa. And that is a very bad approach, guys, because you are shifting away from what the United States can offer Africa to how bad the rest of the world is. It has turned from a diplomacy tour into a scolding session. And this is why China and even Russia will likely build stronger ties with Africa instead of the US. To the BRICS countries, it's all about business and finance. They do not care about countries' local politics, and their only concern is about how to make money for both sides. However, what Yellen is trying to do is mix business with US foreign policy, which is getting more and more incompatible. It's the same playbook they tried to use with Saudi Arabia. Do this and do that, or else pump more oil, or we will be unhappy. America's approach to Africa should be about what I can do for you, right? Instead of trying to counter Russia or China's moves in the continent. Because if this continues, we could see the United States lose the race for Africa and miss working with the future of the world. And let's really understand what Africa means for China and America. This is a battle for global hegemony. Whoever gains the trust of the continent will gain an incredible advantage in the financial world. So let's look beyond just Africa's natural resources because that's obvious, right? And let's look through more the lens of the dollarization, which is more interesting. We know that the world is de-dollarizing and countries in general, they are moving away from US dollars into other currencies and stores of value like gold. So as Africa continues to build up, they will have a choice to either transact mainly in dollars or conduct more bilateral trade away from the reserve currency. And this is what China is trying to promote. They want to internationalize the yuan not just in the Middle East, but in Africa as well. Sure, right now a lot of the loans between China and Africa, they are dollar denominated. However, we might need to think a few steps ahead of what China might be planning. Now, if China continues to be Africa's biggest trading partner and keeps investing in the continent, there could be a point where the Chinese go, hey, let's ditch the dollar and start using the Chinese yuan for more trades. And at that point, the dollarization will accelerate because the future of the world is going to transact more in yuan versus US dollars. So from America's perspective, this will be a disaster. We already know the East is starting to dump their US treasuries and dollar holdings, which is putting upward pressure on bond yields, right? This means borrowing costs in America will continue to stay high, and that's why a big incentive for America to engage with Africa is to keep the dollar as the reserve currency. Because if Africa continues to transact mainly in dollars, right, then the feedback loop of money reinvested back in the US treasuries will continue, guys. It will help the reserve currency buy more time. And remember that back in Davos, Saudi's Foreign Minister Mohammed Al Jadaan mentioned how the kingdom is no longer bound to the dollar for international trade. And this is significant because now other nations realize that maybe they too can survive outside of the dollar system. However, Africa has much more potential than Saudi Arabia because it is still largely untapped. It is still a frontier. So whoever can gain the trust of Africa and build up their infrastructure will be able to propagate their currency further, especially as we move towards CBDCs. Africa could very well be the next stop for the digital yuan. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's realize that Africa will also play a key role in the manufacturing wars between China and the USA. Now, China is still the world's factory, manufacturing the majority of consumer goods around the world. American and European companies still turn to China because making goods there is just so profitable. However, things are starting to change because of two dramatic shifts. The first is the cost of manufacturing in China is starting to creep up compared to Mexico and Vietnam. Now, China still has the technological edge versus other destinations, but if China wants to break away from just being the world's factory, right, they need to partner with a manufacturing hub. And this is where Africa comes into play. They aren't at the level of China just yet, but they are fast approaching the ability to manufacture at scale. China has taken a gamble in outsourcing their production to Africa, turning Ethiopia into a giant fast fashion factory. They have pumped $10 billion into the country to create the Hawassa Industrial Park to help employ 20,000 Ethiopians to help Chinese firms manufacture apparel. And the economics just make sense. According to Wharton, the average cost of manufacturing in Ethiopia is a third of China's cost. An average worker in coastal China could hit up to $600 a month, but in Ethiopia, it's only $100. America knows this, and that's why the battle for Africa is also a battle for manufacturing. Janet Yellen has called multiple times for friendshoring, which basically means shifting manufacturing away from places like China to US allies, including Japan and South Korea. And that's likely one reason why she visited Africa as well. She hopes to one day integrate Africa into America's friendshoring agenda, right? But the US is still lagging behind. The World Trade Organization gave the US a warning about friendshoring and how Africa is being forgotten. And according to WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala, when people talk of friendshoring, I get a little nervous today because I don't know who is a friend. A friend today, maybe tomorrow will not be a friend. When you say that, I never hear any countries in Africa being mentioned. And this shows the US still has a lot of work to do on the African continent because China already has a big advantage from the Belt Road Initiative, right? They have neglected Africa for far too long while China has been paying attention for decades. Now, in the grand scheme of things, Africa is going to play a huge factor in the US-China rivalry. If the US wins over the continent, they can extend American hegemony longer. But because China already has a stronger foothold, it is likely they will win over Africa's trust faster. Yes, right now our focus should be more on the Ukraine conflict and the petrodollar situation in Saudi Arabia, but we cannot neglect Africa, guys. Winning over Africa is essential for both China and the United States. It can help fuel de-dollarization or keep the dollar longer as the world reserve currency. And China is already winning more friends on the continent with more nations like Tanzania firming trade relations with China. As Tanzania's ambassador to China mentioned, two-thirds of Tanzania's 62 million people are aged below 23, offering a young workforce and long-term investment opportunities for the global corporations, especially those in China. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Who will win the trust of Africa? Will it be the United States or China? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.